What's the funniest thing that happened to the worst person? I was the only student in a wheelchair in our entire medical program, and my professor, Mr. Reynolds, made sure I never forgot it. He positioned every lab station just high enough so I couldn't reach it, and put my textbooks onto the highest shelves so he could draw attention to me in class. When I requested accommodations, he'd sigh dramatically and say, "Hospitals won't make special exceptions for you." He'd schedule mandatory study sessions in the basement classroom with no elevator access, then act shocked when I couldn't attend. "A doctor needs to be physically capable of responding to emergencies," he announced during our cardiology rotation while making direct eye contact with me. "Some people simply aren't built for the demands of this profession." Reynolds loved creating arbitrary physical requirements that seemed designed specifically to exclude me. "All students must be able to stand for 4-hour surgeries without breaks," he declared while updating the syllabus. He'd make me demonstrate procedures while standing even though they could easily be done sitting down. When I'd ask why standing was necessary, he'd say real doctors don't negotiate with patients about their physical limitations. "I'm not being discriminatory," he told the dean when I filed my third accessibility complaint. "I'm preparing students for the reality of medical practice where physical capability matters." He'd moved our clinical rotations to the oldest building on campus, with narrow doorways and no accessible restrooms. "If she can't navigate a simple hospital corridor, how will she handle a code blue?" He'd ask other professors loud enough for me to hear. But then one day, Reynolds didn't show up for Monday morning lectures, and the substitute professor apologized for the delay. "Professor Reynolds had an accident over the weekend and will be out for a couple weeks," she explained while students whispered among themselves. By Wednesday, the whole medical school knew the truth about Reynolds' accident. He'd been at his country club trying to impress a woman by jumping over the pool in a golf cart after drinking too much. The golf cart flipped and pinned both his legs underneath, while security cameras captured every humiliating second. Both legs were shattered, and he'd need months in a wheelchair while the bones healed. The footage had already spread like wildfire on the school servers, complete with carnival music in the background. When Reynolds returned 3 weeks later, he was rolling in a manual wheelchair with both legs in bright blue casts. The first thing he discovered was that his own classroom was inaccessible because he'd specifically chosen it for the 3 steps leading to his podium. He had to teach from the back of the room while students craned their necks to see him. The irony was absolutely delicious watching him struggle with the barriers he'd deliberately created. His beloved basement classroom became off-limits since there was no elevator, and he'd fought against installing one for years. "Why didn't anyone tell me these rooms were inaccessible?" he complained to maintenance while I sat in the front row enjoying every second of his frustration. The lab equipment he'd placed on high shelves was now out of his reach, and he had to ask students to get materials for him. The obstacle course he'd designed to exclude me became impossible for him to complete, and he had to cancel the entire requirement. "We're restructuring the emergency response training to focus on medical knowledge rather than physical capability," he announced through gritted teeth. Students were openly smirking as he made accommodations for himself that he'd refused to make for me. Reynolds tried to maintain his authority, but kept running into the accessibility barriers he'd spent years defending. The elevator broke down, and he missed 3 days of classes because he couldn't reach the second floor. His office was up 2 flights of stairs, so he had to hold office hours in random empty classrooms. Students started coming to me for help instead of him because I actually understood how to adapt medical techniques for different physical needs. Reynolds cornered me after class looking desperate and humiliated with sweat stains on his shirt from struggling with his wheelchair. "You need to help me figure out how to make this work," he said, while gesturing around the inaccessible building. I looked at his pathetic face and felt that familiar surge of satisfaction. "Sorry, Professor," I said with the sweetest smile I could manage. "But medical school isn't designed for people with limitations, and maybe you should consider a career path that's more suited to your situation." He grabbed my wrist as I started to roll away, and his grip was stronger than I expected. "You think this is funny, but I can make your life here a living hell," he whispered, while his eyes went dark and desperate. "Help me, or I'll tell everyone you cheated on the entrance exams and forge whatever evidence I need to prove it." His voice got lower and more threatening. "Who do you think they'll believe? The respected professor facing a setback or the whiny cripple?" I pull my wrist free from his grip, and the motion sends a sharp pain up my arm. My heart pounds so hard I can feel it in my throat, and my hands start shaking before I even realize what's happening. His threat hangs in the air between us, and I know this just became much more dangerous than petty classroom harassment. This isn't about lab stations or accessible bathrooms anymore. He's talking about destroying my entire future by making everyone think I cheated my way into medical school. I roll away quickly without saying anything back, because I don't trust my voice right now. The wheels of my chair squeak on the hallway floor, and I can feel his eyes on my back as I move toward the exit. My mind is racing with everything he just said, and I need to get somewhere safe where I can think clearly. I head straight to my dorm room and my hands are still shaking as I fumble with my keys. The door finally opens, and I roll inside and lock it behind me. I pull out my phone and open a new note, because I need to document everything he just said while the words are fresh in my memory. My fingers move fast across the screen, typing out every detail I can remember. The exact location where he cornered me, the way he grabbed my wrist, his threat about telling everyone I cheated on the entrance exams, his promise to forge whatever evidence he needs to prove it, the way his voice got lower and more threatening when he called me a whiny cripple. I add the date and time at the top and save the note with a title that makes it easy to find later. My phone shows it's 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday, and I make sure to note that too. I read through what I wrote 3 times to make sure I didn't miss anything important. Then I open my messages and text Haley asking her to come over immediately because I need a witness to what just happened. I don't explain everything in the text because I want to tell her in person where I can see her reaction. She responds within 2 minutes saying she'll be right there. I sit in my room waiting, and my mind won't stop replaying the whole conversation. The look in his eyes when he threatened me, the strength of his grip on my wrist, the calculated way he framed it as helping him versus destroying my career. 20 minutes later, I hear a knock on my door, and I roll over to let Haley inside. She takes one look at my face and asks what happened. I tell her everything while she pulls out her laptop and starts taking notes with timestamps. She types fast and asks questions to make sure she gets all the details right. What time did this happen? Where exactly were you standing? What were his exact words? Did anyone else see or hear this? I answer each question and watch her document everything in a clean, organized file. When I finish telling her the whole story, she stops typing and looks at me with real concern on her face. She suggests I record any future interactions with Reynolds, since threatening to fabricate evidence crosses a serious line. I hadn't thought of that, but it makes sense. I pull up my phone browser and start researching state recording laws while Haley watches over my shoulder. It takes about 15 minutes of reading through legal websites, but I finally discover that I can legally record conversations I'm part of without telling the other person. My state is a one-party consent state, which means only one person in the conversation needs to know about the recording. Relief washes over me, because this gives me a way to protect myself if he tries anything else. Haley helps me test the voice recording app on my phone to make sure it works properly and picks up clear audio. We do a practice run where she stands across the room and talks in a normal voice, and the recording comes out clear enough to understand every word. I save the recording instructions in my notes, so I don't forget how to use it in the moment. After Haley leaves, I open my email and compose a message to Disability Services requesting an urgent meeting with my coordinator, Zara Green. I keep the message vague, but mark it high priority because I don't want to put everything in writing before talking to someone face-to-face. I write that I need to discuss a serious accommodation issue that requires immediate attention. My finger hovers over the send button for a second before I press it. The email whooshes away, and I sit back in my chair feeling exhausted from the adrenaline wearing off. Zara responds within an hour, offering me a slot tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I accept immediately and add it to my calendar. That night I barely sleep because I keep replaying Reynolds' threat over and over in my mind. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face and hear his voice promising to forge evidence of cheating. I wonder if he's already started planting fake proof somewhere in the school systems. Maybe he's creating fake emails or documents that make it look like I got test answers ahead of time. My mind races through worst-case scenarios where his word carries more weight than mine because he's a respected professor and I'm just a student. What if he's been planning this for weeks and already has everything ready to go? What if the administration believes him without even investigating? What if this ends my medical career before it really starts? I check my phone every hour looking for suspicious emails or notifications, but nothing comes through. The room stays dark and quiet, except for the sound of my racing thoughts. When my alarm finally goes off at 7 a.m., I feel like I haven't slept at all. I get ready slowly and head to the Disability Services office, arriving 15 minutes early. Zara greets me at the door and leads me into a small private meeting room with a table and comfortable chairs. I lay out everything that's happened, including the blackmail threat, and she listens carefully while taking detailed notes on a yellow legal pad. Her pen moves steadily across the paper, and she doesn't interrupt me once. When I finish talking, she looks up, and I can see genuine concern on her face as the pattern becomes clear. She asks a few clarifying questions about dates and times and specific words Reynolds used. Then she advises me to create a contemporaneous written record of every interaction with Reynolds going forward. She explains that documentation is my strongest protection, and the more detailed records I have, the harder it will be for him to dispute what happened. She suggests I loop in a faculty witness whenever possible for important academic situations like exams or lab work, Having another professor present makes it much harder for Reynolds to retaliate without someone noticing. I ask about interim accommodations to minimize contact with Reynolds, and Zara says she'll submit a formal request to the department. Her expression gets more serious, and she warns me the process takes time, and the department might push back, citing budget constraints or scheduling difficulties. She's seen it happen before, where they drag their feet on accommodations that inconvenience faculty members. I leave her office feeling slightly better, because at least someone believes me and knows what to do, but I also feel the weight of knowing this is going to be a long fight. The next day, I return to class feeling exposed and vulnerable because Reynolds is back teaching from his wheelchair at the front of the room. He's talking about cardiovascular procedures and using a pointer to indicate diagrams on the screen behind him. I take my usual seat and try to focus on the lecture material. About halfway through, he pauses and scans the room, and his eyes land on me. He makes direct eye contact and holds it for several seconds longer than necessary. I see something calculating in his expression that makes my stomach turn. It's not anger or frustration, but something colder and more deliberate. He's planning something, and he wants me to know it. I force myself to look away and write notes on my laptop, but my hands are shaking again. The rest of the lecture passes in a blur, and I can barely remember what he said by the time class ends. 2 days later, I'm checking my email between classes and see a notification from the academic portal about my recent lab assignment grade. I click through and stare at the screen because the grade is way lower than I expected, a 72 when my work was solid, and I know I followed all the instructions carefully. The feedback section has barely 2 sentences saying my technique needed improvement, and my documentation was incomplete, which makes no sense because I triple-checked everything before submitting. I immediately suspect this is Reynolds starting his retaliation campaign, and my stomach twists with anger and fear at the same time. I navigate to the course page and download the detailed grading rubric, then pull up my original assignment file and start comparing them line by line. After 20 minutes of careful review, I find 3 separate deductions for criteria that weren't anywhere in the original assignment instructions we received. One section lost points for not including a safety protocol checklist that was never mentioned as required. Another section got marked down for using abbreviated terminology when the style guide we got said abbreviations were acceptable. The third deduction claimed I didn't cite a specific reference text that wasn't even on our required reading list. I take screenshots of everything, including the original instructions, the grading rubric, and my submitted work with timestamps showing when each document was created. Then I open a new document and start writing down exactly what's wrong with each deduction, keeping my language factual and calm, even though I want to scream. I need to find someone outside Reynolds' department who can review this objectively and back me up. I remember hearing about Rafael Hassan, a faculty member in the physiology department who apparently helped another student challenge an unfair grade last year. I find his email address in the campus directory and start composing a message, keeping it professional but direct about what's happening. I explain that I received a grade that seems inconsistent with the stated criteria, and I've documented specific discrepancies between the rubric and the original assignment instructions. I attach my comparison document and ask if he'd be willing to review the situation as a neutral third party. I read through the email 3 times, checking for anything that sounds whiny or accusatory before hitting send. The response comes back in less than 2 hours, which surprises me. Rafael says he's reviewed my documentation, and the discrepancies are concerning enough that he'd be happy to supervise any makeup work or future assignments to ensure fair evaluation. He suggests we meet in his office tomorrow afternoon to discuss the situation in detail and figure out the best path forward. Reading his email, I feel this surge of hope that someone with actual institutional standing believes me and is willing to help. I write back immediately confirming the meeting time and thanking him for taking this seriously. That same afternoon, I get another email, this one from the accommodation office, with a response to my request for interim measures to minimize contact with Reynolds. The message is full of bureaucratic language about budget constraints and scheduling conflicts that make immediate changes difficult to implement. They say they're exploring options, but can't guarantee any modifications before the end of the semester. I forward the email to Zara with a frustrated message asking if this is normal, and she calls me within 10 minutes. She says this kind of resistance is extremely common when accommodations would inconvenience faculty members or require department resources. The administration always claims they're working on it while hoping the problem resolves itself or the student gives up. She tells me she's going to push back harder and escalate to her supervisor, but warns me to prepare for this to take weeks. The next day, I have my required lab session, and I feel sick walking into that room knowing Reynolds will be there. I get to my station early and set up my materials, then casually slip my phone into my lab coat pocket with the voice recorder app already running. Reynolds wheels over about 5 minutes into the session and positions himself right next to my workspace, where he can watch everything I do. He starts making comments about proper technique and attention to detail, his voice just loud enough that other students can hear. I keep my hands steady and focus on the procedure steps, refusing to engage with his provocations or show any reaction. Every few minutes he'll point out some tiny detail, like the angle I'm holding an instrument or how I'm labeling a sample. I document each step carefully and complete the work exactly according to the protocol sheet. When the session ends, I pack up quickly and head for the door, but Reynolds calls out, asking me to stay behind for a moment to discuss my recent lab grade. I see Haley near the doorway and make eye contact with her, and she immediately understands something's wrong. She lingers in the hallway where she can see through the window into the lab room. I check that my phone is still recording and the battery is good, then turn back to Reynolds and say, I have a few minutes. He wheels closer, and his expression shifts into this carefully concerned look that makes my skin crawl. He starts by saying he's worried about my recent performance and noticed I seem stressed during lab sessions. His tone is gentle and almost fatherly, which is completely different from his usual hostility. He suggests that maybe the demands of medical school are too much for someone with my particular limitations, and perhaps I should consider whether this is really the right path. I realize immediately what he's doing, building a paper trail that makes it look like he's a concerned professor, worried about a struggling student, rather than someone actively sabotaging me. I force myself to stay calm and keep my voice even when I respond that I'm confident in my work quality and would actually welcome a third-party review of my recent assignments to ensure objective evaluation. Reynolds' expression tightens for just a second before he smooths it back into fake concern. He says that won't be necessary, and he's sure we can work this out between ourselves without involving other people. Then he leans forward and drops his voice lower, and I can smell coffee on his breath as he speaks. He says in this quiet, deliberate tone that he's willing to forget about those cheating concerns he mentioned before if I'm willing to withdraw my accessibility complaints and stop making trouble. The recording is capturing every word, and I feel this cold, clear certainty settle over me as he confirms his retaliation in his own voice, using his own words. I tell him I need some time to think about it, and I'll get back to him soon. I grab my bag and head for the door before he can press me further or realize what just happened. Outside in the hallway, Haley sees my face and immediately asks what's wrong, and I can barely keep the smile off my face when I tell her I got exactly what I needed on tape. That evening, I schedule an emergency meeting with Zara and arrive at her office with my phone clutched in my hand. She closes the door, and I play the recording without any introduction. Her expression stays neutral through most of it, but when Reynolds makes the explicit offer to forget the cheating allegations, if I withdraw my complaints, her eyes close briefly, and she exhales slowly. She tells me this changes everything, and we need to escalate to HR and the dean immediately, because this is textbook retaliation with evidence. I feel this wave of relief that someone finally believes me and has the power to do something about it. Zara starts drafting an incident report while I sit there, and the reality sinks in that this is actually happening. She explains the formal complaint process and warns me that Reynolds will likely escalate his attacks before the investigation starts because he knows he's in serious trouble now. The next morning, I wake up to an email notification, and my stomach drops when I see Reynolds copied the dean. The subject line reads, "Academic Integrity Concern," and my hands shake as I open it. Reynolds writes in this formal, concerned tone that he's discovered troubling similarities between my recent assignment and online sources. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He attaches 3 screenshots that show passages from my work next to matching text from medical websites. At first glance, they look really damning because the text is identical, and there are no quotation marks or citations visible in his screenshots. I know I never plagiarized anything, but seeing it laid out like this makes my chest tight with panic. The email requests an immediate academic integrity hearing and suggests I might want to consider withdrawing from the program voluntarily to avoid a formal finding on my record. I call Haley right away, and she comes over within 30 minutes. We pull up my original document files and compare them to Reynolds' screenshots line by line. It takes us almost an hour, but we finally figure out what he did. He took my properly cited references and cropped the screenshots to cut off the citation information at the bottom of each page. He also edited out the quotation marks I used around the direct quotes and removed the in-text citations that appeared in parentheses. My stomach drops as I understand how far he's willing to go, because this isn't just making false accusations. He actively fabricated evidence by manipulating my work to make it look like plagiarism. Haley suggests we take screenshots of everything with metadata, showing the file creation dates and modification history, before he can claim I altered anything after his accusation. I contact Zara again, and we spend the afternoon drafting a careful response to the dean. I provide the original document files with full citations and metadata, showing they haven't been modified since I submitted them. I include screenshots proving the quotation marks and citations that Reynolds cropped out of his version. Zara helps me write everything in formal academic language that clearly demonstrates the manipulation without sounding emotional or defensive. I want to mention the recording of his blackmail threat, but Zara says we need to time that revelation strategically within the formal complaint process. She explains that if we play that card too early, Reynolds might claim the recording is fake or taken out of context. We need to let him dig himself deeper with the plagiarism accusations first, so the pattern of retaliation becomes undeniable. Haley texts me later that evening saying the golf cart footage of Reynolds has gone viral among medical students at other schools. Apparently, someone added sound effects, and it's become a meme with thousands of views. She sends me links to 3 different versions, including one with cartoon stars circling his head when the cart flips. Part of me wants to share it everywhere and amplify the humiliation because he deserves it after everything he's done to me. But Zara specifically warned me against anything that could be framed as harassment on my part. She explained that Reynolds will try to paint himself as the victim of a vindictive disabled student, and any evidence of me mocking his accident would support that narrative. I save the links in a private folder and resist the temptation to forward them, even though it feels unfair that he gets to attack me while I have to stay professional. The following week, I show up for a required clinical simulation and discover Reynolds has assigned me to testing Station 7. The problem is that Station 7 is in a corner with equipment blocking wheelchair access, and the table height is completely wrong for someone sitting down. I check the assignment board and see that Stations 2 and 5 are both accessible and currently empty. When I point this out, Reynolds claims all accessible stations are already reserved for other students with accommodations. I pull out my accommodation letter from Disability Services and present it to the simulation coordinator who's standing right there. The coordinator looks uncomfortable and asks Reynolds why the accessible stations aren't available. Reynolds starts making excuses about equipment calibration and specific training requirements, but his face is red and several other students are watching the whole confrontation. The coordinator finally overrides him and reassigns me to Station 5 while Reynolds glares at me like I just committed some terrible offense. During the actual simulation exam, Reynolds positions himself right next to my station and hovers there making comments about proper technique. Every few minutes he points out some tiny detail, like the angle I'm holding an instrument or how I'm labeling a sample. I focus on completing the work exactly according to the protocol sheet and try to ignore his constant presence. The other students at nearby stations don't get this level of scrutiny, and I can feel their eyes on us as Reynolds continues his commentary. When the session finally ends, I pack up quickly and head straight to a quiet study room. I pull out my phone and document everything that just happened, including specific timestamps and the names of students who witnessed it. I write down every comment Reynolds made and describe his physical positioning and tone of voice. This documentation is exhausting, but Zara emphasized that details matter when building a case for systematic harassment. The following week, I'm scheduled for a written exam in Reynolds' course and arrive early to get settled. The classroom has been rearranged since last time, and I discover the only accessible desk placement is directly in front of where Reynolds will be monitoring the exam. Every other accessible spot has been blocked by equipment or furniture that wasn't there before. I recognize this as deliberate intimidation because he wants me to feel watched and pressured throughout the entire test. I take the seat anyway and arrange my materials while Reynolds watches me with this satisfied expression. When the exam starts, I force myself to focus on the questions and block out his presence, even though I can feel his eyes on me constantly. The test covers material from the past 3 weeks, and I've studied extensively, so I feel reasonably confident about most of the content. Halfway through the exam, Reynolds suddenly announces a clarification to question 15. He says the scenario should specify that the patient has a history of cardiac issues, which changes the correct treatment approach. I look up from my paper and see several students exchange confused glances because he specifically told us in lecture that this type of patient would not have cardiac complications. The clarification directly contradicts what he taught us, and I realize he's setting me up to fail by changing expectations in the middle of the test. Some students start erasing their answers and rewriting them, while others sit there looking uncertain. I make a note on my exam paper documenting the time of the announcement and the contradiction to his lecture material. Then I answer the question both ways and add a note explaining the discrepancy, so I have evidence of what happened. I finish the exam and hand it in with my documentation note still attached to the last page. Reynolds takes it without looking at me and I walk out of the classroom feeling drained and angry. Before I even get back to my dorm, I pull out my laptop and navigate to the Academic Affairs website. I download the formal grade appeal form and start filling it out immediately while everything is fresh in my mind. The paperwork asks for detailed descriptions of specific policy violations, and I'm meticulous about citing the exact sections of the student handbook that Reynolds violated. I attach my documentation of the testing conditions, the mid-exam clarification, and the pattern of behavior over the past several weeks. The form requires supporting evidence, so I include timestamps, witness names, and copies of my accommodation letters. By the time I submit everything, it's almost midnight, but I feel this grim satisfaction, knowing I've created an official record that can't be ignored or dismissed. 2 days later, I get an email from Reynolds, copied to the clinical rotation coordinator, stating that I haven't completed the required physical capability assessment for the upcoming hospital placement. The message claims this assessment has always been mandatory and suggests I need to demonstrate I can navigate emergency situations before being cleared for patient contact. I feel my stomach drop because this is a completely new requirement that nobody else in my cohort has mentioned, and the timing is obviously retaliation for the grade appeal. I immediately pull up my accommodation approval letter from Disability Services and forward it to the rotation coordinator with a brief note asking for clarification about this physical assessment requirement. Within 3 hours, the coordinator responds, saying that Reynolds' requirement isn't part of the standard rotation criteria, and my accommodations are already on file, so I'm cleared to begin next week as scheduled. The coordinator copies Reynolds on the response, and I can almost feel his anger through the screen, but the attempt to block me failed. Still, the whole thing rattles me, because it shows Reynolds is actively looking for new ways to create barriers, even while facing the grade appeal process. That night, I sit at my desk trying to focus on regular coursework, but my brain feels like it's running on empty. I've spent so much energy fighting Reynolds and documenting everything that my actual medical studies are suffering, and I can feel myself falling behind in my other classes. The constant battles are wearing me down in ways that feel harder to measure than a bad test grade, and I realize I need help managing the stress before it destroys my academic performance completely. The next morning, I email my academic advisor asking about campus mental health resources, and she responds with a referral to the counseling center, along with a note saying several other students have reached out about stress management this semester. I call the counseling center and get an appointment for Thursday afternoon with a therapist who specializes in disability discrimination and academic pressure. The intake coordinator mentions that this therapist has worked with other students navigating accommodation disputes, and I feel a small sense of relief that someone might actually understand what I'm dealing with. Our next class session with Reynolds happens 3 days after the rotation coordinator overrode his barrier attempt. Reynolds wheels himself to the front of the room, and before starting the lecture, he makes this big announcement about needing to request some temporary accommodations for his own accessibility needs. He uses phrases like reasonable modifications and equal access to educational opportunities that are clearly copied straight from disability rights materials and legal frameworks. The performance feels calculated and gross because he's co-opting the exact language that advocates fought for, while simultaneously having spent years blocking my access to those same protections. Several students nod sympathetically as Reynolds describes the challenges of navigating campus in a wheelchair, and I watch him reframe himself as a victim of an inaccessible system, rather than someone who deliberately maintained those barriers. A classmate sitting near me whispers that it must be so hard for Reynolds to suddenly face these obstacles, and I bite my tongue to keep from screaming that he created most of these problems himself. The HR investigation finally begins 2 weeks after I submitted my formal complaint. 2 representatives meet with me in a small conference room, and they actually seem genuinely concerned as I walk them through the timeline of events. I provide the audio recording of Reynolds' blackmail threat and watch their faces change as they listen to his voice, making the explicit quid pro quo offer. I hand over my documentation binder with every incident organized by date and category, along with the written witness statement that Haley prepared describing what she observed. The representatives take careful notes and ask specific questions about the pattern of behavior and the impact on my academic performance. They assure me they're taking the matter seriously and explain that the investigation will include interviews with other faculty and students who might have relevant information. Before I leave, they tell me to report any further contact or retaliation from Reynolds immediately, and I feel cautiously hopeful that someone with actual authority is finally paying attention. 3 days later, I receive an official email from HR stating that pending the outcome of their investigation, Reynolds is restricted from having direct contact with me outside of required classroom instruction. The message explains that all my assignments in his course will now be graded by other faculty members to ensure fairness, and I can request alternative supervision for any required activities where Reynolds would normally be the only option. I forward the email to Zara, and she responds with a simple thumbs-up emoji and a note saying, "This is a significant step that shows HR found enough preliminary evidence to warrant protective measures." The proxy grading arrangement starts immediately, and I submit my next lab report to a different professor in the department who I've never worked with before. The substitute grading helps create some distance, but I notice pretty quickly that the other evaluators seem influenced by Reynolds' initial low marks on my record. My new lab report comes back with a grade that's better than what Reynolds gave me, but still lower than what I know the work deserves based on the rubric criteria. I request detailed scoring breakdowns for everything going forward and start comparing my work to the stated standards point by point. I build a spreadsheet documenting where my submissions meet the rubric requirements but still receive reduced scores, and the pattern suggests that Reynolds' narrative about my struggling performance has contaminated how other faculty view my work. I collect this evidence methodically, knowing I might need it to demonstrate continued bias, even with the proxy grading system in place. Raphael reaches out the following week and offers to supervise my next high-stakes exam to ensure completely fair conditions without any Reynolds influence. I accept immediately and take the test in Raphael's office on a Friday afternoon, with no one watching over my shoulder or making intimidating announcements mid-exam. The testing environment feels almost surreal in its normalcy, and I can actually focus on demonstrating my knowledge without the constant stress of wondering what Reynolds will do next. I finish the exam feeling confident about my answers, and when Raphael returns the graded test a week later, I scored in the top range, which directly counters Reynolds' narrative that I'm academically struggling or unprepared for medical training. Raphael includes a note with the grade saying he'd be happy to provide documentation of my performance for any future proceedings, and I add his offer to my growing file of support. 3 weeks into the HR investigation, I receive formal notice that a hearing panel is being scheduled to review my retaliation complaint. The email outlines the process and timeline and explains that I'll have the opportunity to present my case to 3 neutral administrators, including Dean Chamberlain. I immediately forward the notice to Zara and ask if she can help me prepare, because the idea of presenting everything to a formal panel makes my hands shake. We meet in her office that afternoon, and she coaches me on how to organize my evidence, focusing on facts and documentation rather than emotional reactions to what happened. She helps me create a clear timeline of events with supporting evidence for each incident and reminds me that the panel will be looking for patterns of behavior and clear policy violations. We practice my opening statement, and she stops me twice when I start describing how Reynolds' actions made me feel instead of what he actually did. By the end of our prep session, I have a structured presentation plan and feel slightly less terrified about the upcoming hearing. The next morning, I wake up to an email from Reynolds sent directly to my student account, despite the HR contact restrictions. The message is carefully worded, suggesting that we could resolve this situation privately and avoid the stress of a formal hearing process. He writes that he recognizes we've had some misunderstandings, and if I withdraw the complaints, he'll recommend me for a competitive clinical placement at the teaching hospital that would significantly strengthen my residency applications. The offer is phrased as a generous opportunity rather than an obvious bribe, and I can see how he's trying to make the problem disappear on his terms while making it look like he's doing me a favor. I read the email 3 times, feeling anger build in my chest because he still thinks he can manipulate the situation and make me back down if he just finds the right leverage. I forward the settlement offer email to both HR and Zara within 10 minutes of receiving it, along with a note pointing out that this constitutes continued inappropriate contact in violation of the restrictions they placed on him. Zara responds immediately saying, "This actually strengthens my case significantly because it demonstrates Reynolds' consciousness of wrongdoing and his ongoing attempts to interfere with the complaint process." The HR representatives send a formal acknowledgement that they've received the evidence and will be adding it to the investigation file. I save all the email threads and feel this grim satisfaction knowing that Reynolds' attempt to bypass the formal process just gave me more ammunition to prove he's been retaliating against me all along. That night, I spend 3 hours researching federal complaint procedures on the Department of Education website. The ADA complaint process looks complicated with forms and documentation requirements, but I bookmark everything and save copies to a folder labeled Backup Options. Section 504 has similar procedures, and I read through example complaints to understand how people describe discrimination patterns. I don't file anything yet, because Zara said to let the internal process play out first, but having these options ready makes me feel less trapped by whatever the school decides. The next morning, I head to my usual lecture hall and find a maintenance sign blocking the entrance saying the elevator is broken again. My stomach drops because this building has classes on 3 different floors, and I immediately start calculating which sessions I'll miss. But then I see an email notification on my phone from the department coordinator saying all classes are temporarily relocated to the accessible science building across campus. The message doesn't make a big deal about it and just lists the new room numbers, but I know this never would have happened before the investigation started. I roll to the new location and find other students already setting up, and nobody complains about the room change. The accommodation feels basic and obvious, but also significant because it happened without me having to fight for it. After class, I'm rolling through the main hallway when I hear 2 professors talking near the faculty lounge. I slow down because I recognize their voices, and one of them says something about Reynolds getting stuck trying to get through the doorway to the records office. The other one laughs and makes a joke about karma being a narrow doorframe. Part of me feels this rush of satisfaction hearing them acknowledge what Reynolds did to himself. But then the first professor does this mocking impression of Reynolds struggling with his wheelchair, and I feel uncomfortable because the joke isn't really about his behavior anymore. It's just making fun of someone having physical problems, and that's not the kind of justice I wanted, even if Reynolds deserves criticism for his actual actions. I keep rolling and pretend I didn't hear them because I don't want to be associated with that kind of mocking, even though Reynolds treated me worse for years. The next day, I'm waiting outside a department meeting room for a different class when I see Reynolds approaching the doorway. The doorframe is older and narrower than modern standards, and I watch him try to angle his wheelchair through. He has to back up twice and adjust his approach, and his face is red with effort and embarrassment. Students inside the meeting room can see everything through the open door, and some of them are watching. I deliberately turn my head and look at my phone because I don't want to be the person who enjoys watching someone struggle with barriers, even if those barriers exist because of choices he made. When I look up again, he's made it through, and I feel this weird mix of relief and frustration because I still hate what he did, but I don't want to become cruel myself. The night before the hearing, Haley comes to my apartment with her laptop and a box of folders. We spread everything across my kitchen table, and she helps me organize the exhibits in chronological order. The audio recording gets labeled as Exhibit A, and I have printed transcripts with timestamps. The grade documentation becomes Exhibit B, with side-by-side comparisons of my work and the rubric. Haley makes me practice my opening statement 3 times and stops me when I start using emotional language instead of factual descriptions. She reminds me to breathe and stay focused on the pattern of behavior rather than how angry it made me feel. By midnight, we have everything organized in a binder with tabs, and I feel slightly less terrified about presenting to the panel tomorrow. The hearing takes place in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the administration building. 3 panel members sit on one side of a long table, including Dean Chamberlain in the center. I roll up to the opposite side and place my binder in front of me while my hands shake slightly. The panel chair explains the process, and I present my statement reading from notes I practiced. I describe the escalating pattern of barriers and accommodation denials and the blackmail threat after his accident. I submit the audio recording and they listen to the whole thing in silence. Reynolds' voice comes through clearly making the explicit quid pro quo offer and threatening to fabricate cheating evidence. One panel member takes notes while another reviews my documentation timeline. They ask questions about specific incidents, and I answer as factually as possible, citing dates and witnesses. Reynolds presents his defense after a short break, and he argues that his emphasis on physical capability reflects real concerns about patient safety. He says medical practice requires certain physical standards, and he was trying to prepare students for professional reality. But his voice wavers when he talks about his own accident, and I see his hands grip the table edge. He claims my complaints are retaliation for legitimate academic feedback, but he can't explain the recorded threat. I watch his face and see genuine fear underneath the justifications, and I realize he knows the evidence is damning. The panel reviews additional materials that Zara obtained through her access to administrative files. She managed to get maintenance request emails from 3 years ago, showing Reynolds specifically objected to proposed accessibility upgrades in his primary teaching building. The emails show him arguing that the modifications were unnecessary and would set a bad precedent for accommodation requests. He wrote that the building's barriers served as useful preparation for students who would face similar challenges in the hospital environments. Several panel members exchange looks as they read through the evidence of deliberate barrier creation. One of them asks Reynolds directly why he blocked accessibility improvements, and he stumbles through an answer about budget priorities that doesn't match the tone of his original emails. The hearing concludes after 2 hours, and the panel chair says they'll issue a preliminary decision within 48 hours. I thank them and gather my materials while my brain feels foggy from the intensity. I have to go straight from the hearing to a regular exam in another course, and I struggle to shift mental gears from formal complaint presentation to biochemistry questions. The exam feels surreal, and I barely remember what I wrote down. 2 days later, I receive an official email with the interim finding. The message says, retaliation has been substantiated based on the audio evidence and pattern of adverse actions following my accommodation requests. Reynolds is immediately removed from direct teaching responsibilities pending the outcome of the full investigation. I read the decision 3 times to make sure I understand it correctly. Relief floods through me, mixed with this residual anxiety, because I know Reynolds won't accept this quietly, and there's still a full investigation to complete. But for now, he can't grade my work or control my access to required courses, and that feels like I can finally breathe without constantly watching for his next move against me. 3 days after the interim decision, the administration sends an email announcing a complete accessibility audit of all medical school facilities. The message says Zara will lead the review, and they're looking for student input on priority areas. She emails me directly that afternoon, asking if I'd be willing to serve as a student representative, and I stare at the message for a long time before responding. My brain feels like it's been through a meat grinder from the hearing process, but I know this audit could actually fix things beyond just my situation. I write back saying yes, and she schedules a planning meeting for the following week. The next morning, I walk into anatomy lab, and 3 students approach me separately to apologize for not speaking up sooner about Reynolds' behavior. They say they noticed the barriers, but didn't realize how deliberate it all was until the hearing evidence came out. I appreciate the apologies, but there's this weird distance now, like they're not sure how to act around me. 2 students who used to study with me regularly suddenly have scheduling conflicts every time I suggest meeting up. I realize some professional relationships got permanently damaged by this whole situation, and there's no easy way to repair them. During lunch, Haley mentions that people are taking sides, even though the official decision already came down, and I can feel the political tension whenever I enter common spaces. The isolation hits differently now, because it's not just Reynolds targeting me, but also the social fallout from fighting back against him. 2 weeks later, I receive notification that Reynolds has filed a countercomplaint with HR, alleging that I've been harassing him by documenting his accessibility struggles and sharing information about his accident. The email says they're opening a parallel inquiry, and I need to provide a statement responding to his allegations. I sit in my room reading the complaint details and feel this crushing exhaustion settle over me because I have to defend myself all over again. He claims I've been taking photos of him struggling with doors and stairs, then sharing them with other students to humiliate him. The accusation is completely false, but I know it'll take time and energy to disprove, and the process will drag on for weeks. I forward everything to Zara, and she responds within an hour, saying this is a common retaliation tactic, and we have documentation showing I never photographed him or spread information beyond official complaint channels. But knowing it's predictable doesn't make it less exhausting to live through. The next day, I meet with an attorney who specializes in disability rights to discuss filing external complaints with the Department of Education. Her office is downtown, and she reviews all my documentation, including the hearing outcome and Reynolds' countercomplaint. She explains that I could file under ADA and Section 504 procedures, but the process takes months and might not produce better results than the internal investigation already achieved. We talk through the pros and cons for over an hour and decide to hold off on external complaints unless the internal process stalls or produces an insufficient remedy. She says having the option available gives me leverage if the school tries to sweep things under the rug, and I should keep detailed records of everything moving forward. The consultation costs $300 that I don't really have, but I feel better knowing I have professional legal advice backing up my decisions. Within a week, the registrar contacts me saying my schedule has been adjusted, so I'm no longer taking any courses in Reynolds' department for the remainder of the semester. They've moved me to alternative sections taught by other faculty and shifted some requirements to next year. I read through the changes and realized this means I lose access to a potential recommendation letter for residency applications because Reynolds supervised my clinical work in his specialty area. The trade-off feels worth it to escape his direct influence, but I'm aware this could affect my competitiveness for certain residency programs. I email my faculty advisor explaining the situation and asking if other professors might be willing to write stronger letters given the circumstances. She responds supportively and suggests 3 alternative faculty members who could speak to my clinical abilities, and I start setting up meetings to build those relationships. Over the following month, the accessibility audit produces visible changes around campus. I walk into the main teaching building one morning and see workers installing adjustable height lab stations that can be raised or lowered depending on who's using them. The department orders a portable accessible podium that gets moved between classrooms so professors don't have to teach from the back of the room anymore. Maintenance fixes the elevator that's been broken on and off for months and posts a sign saying it's now on a priority maintenance schedule. I watch these physical modifications happen and feel this quiet satisfaction that something concrete came from fighting Reynolds. The changes benefit everyone, not just wheelchair users, and I overhear able-bodied students commenting that the adjustable stations are actually more comfortable for them too. Zara asks me to test the new equipment and provide feedback, and I spend an afternoon going through different buildings, documenting what works and what still needs adjustment. Campus gossip about the whole situation gradually dies down as people move on to newer drama, and I return to a more normal routine. The isolation still lingers because some students continue avoiding me like they're worried about being associated with controversy. But the daily workload becomes normally challenging rather than deliberately impossible, and I can focus on actual medical education instead of constantly fighting for basic access. I study for exams without wondering if the testing conditions will be fair, and I complete lab assignments without checking if the equipment is reachable. The difference feels huge, even though it's just basic accommodation that should have existed from the start. I catch myself relaxing during lectures and realize I'm not constantly watching for Reynolds' next move anymore. The hypervigilance slowly fades, and I sleep better at night. I hear through the grapevine that Reynolds is extending his medical leave for a long time and might not return this academic year. Nobody knows if it's because his legs aren't healing properly or because he's avoiding the aftermath of the hearing. There's no formal announcement or apology, and I'm left with this weird feeling about his absence. Part of me wanted him to face consequences while still present so he'd have to see the changes happening. But another part feels relieved not to encounter him in hallways or worry about running into him on campus. The lack of closure bothers me more than I expected because the situation just kind of fades away instead of reaching a clear ending. During this time, I write an ethics reflection paper for my medical humanities course on the concept of medical capability as a collaborative construct rather than individual limitation. I argue that hospitals and medical teams should be designed to support different physical abilities rather than excluding people who don't meet arbitrary standards. The professor returns my paper with detailed comments and measured praise about the argument's clarity. She suggests I consider submitting a revised version to a medical education journal and includes the names of 2 publications that might be interested. I read her feedback multiple times and feel this unexpected pride that something good came from the Reynolds situation beyond just surviving it. 6 weeks after the hearing, HR issues its final outcome in a formal letter. Reynolds will serve a suspension without pay for the remainder of the semester and must complete mandatory training on disability accommodation and professional conduct before returning to teaching duties. The letter says his behavior violated multiple university policies and created a hostile educational environment. But he's not fired, and there's no permanent notation on his record beyond the internal disciplinary file. I read the decision and feel both validated that they took it seriously and frustrated by the incomplete justice. He gets to come back eventually while I'm stuck with the professional relationships he damaged and the residency recommendation I lost. The outcome is better than nothing but falls short of actual accountability, and I know he'll probably be more careful about getting caught rather than genuinely changing his beliefs about disability and medical practice. 2 weeks after the HR decision, I receive a terse email stating the counter-complaint against me has been closed due to lack of evidence. There's no formal announcement to clear my name, and no acknowledgement that Reynolds' retaliation complaint was baseless from the start. I forward the email to Zara, and she calls me within an hour to say, this is standard procedure, but I can tell from her voice she knows how frustrating it is. The whole process leaves me feeling like I proved my innocence, but nobody bothered to tell anyone else, and I'm stuck carrying the weight of having been accused, even though nothing came of it. My clinical rotation grades post the following week, and I see solid Bs across the board with 1 A- in the practical skills assessment. The marks reflect my actual work rather than inflated praise or unfair penalties, and I stare at the screen, feeling this quiet pride that I survived the semester on my own merit. These aren't the perfect scores I imagined getting before Reynolds made everything so difficult, but they're honest grades that I earned through real competence rather than special treatment or deliberate sabotage. I print out the grade report and file it with all my other documentation because these numbers represent something important about making it through. The Accessibility Task Force sends me an invitation to join as a permanent student representative, and I accept immediately. We start meeting twice a month in the student union, and I volunteer to draft practical checklists for quick fixes in different campus buildings. The work involves walking through spaces with maintenance staff and identifying which barriers can be addressed with simple solutions versus major renovations. I spend hours creating detailed spreadsheets that prioritize ramp installations and door hardware replacements, and the project gives me a sense of purpose that extends beyond just fighting for my own accommodations. Seeing the lists get approved and watching workers actually make changes feels more satisfying than any grade or award. Haley and I have an honest conversation over coffee about how much emotional support I've been asking from her during the Reynolds situation. She's careful with her words, but admits she felt overwhelmed sometimes by the intensity of everything I was dealing with. We agree on clearer boundaries where I'll check in before launching into heavy topics, and she'll be direct when she needs space. I also propose starting a small peer support group for disabled and chronically ill medical students, and she helps me send out a general announcement to the class. 5 students show up to the first meeting in a basement conference room, and we spend 2 hours sharing stories and strategies. Having community support feels sustainable in a way that relying on individual friendship couldn't be, and I leave the meeting feeling less isolated than I have in months. 3 days before finals week, Reynolds sends a brief email to the entire accessibility task force, acknowledging the new policies and facility improvements. His message is professionally worded and mentions the importance of inclusive medical education, but there's no direct apology for his previous actions or recognition of the harm he caused. I read the email once while sitting in the library and then archive it without responding because I don't need his validation anymore. The semester ends with me still enrolled and moving forward to second year, the accessibility barriers measurably reduced through documented changes and a clearer understanding that institutional progress happens slowly through persistent work rather than dramatic confrontations. I'm tired in a way that goes deeper than physical exhaustion, but I'm still standing, and the path forward in medicine feels possible again, even if it's not the triumphant vindication I once imagined. And that's the wrap-up. I try to keep these stories simple but meaningful, something you can actually use. If it gave you even one idea or bit of clarity, that's enough. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.